So without further ado, I want to introduce Erin Strong, who will be our first presenter. And there we go.
Great.
Erin.
Wonderful. So thanks so much, Esperanza, and thanks to everyone for logging on today to attend the MOCA Spring Update. Our goal today is really to just provide updates on several different projects and initiatives that are relevant to implementing the State Commission's goals on ocean and coastal acidification in Maine, which is what the MOCA partnership is focused on. So rather than get everyone together in a room, we thought we'd try a new format that actually helps accomplish one of our goals, which is to reduce carbon dioxide, and all the more important given the news this morning that the Paris Agreement will be exited by the United States. So with that, cheery news, I wanted to launch us into our first session today, which is really an update on something that many of you are likely quite aware of, but we wanted to take the time to make sure that everyone knew what was going on and was aware of the upcoming special referendum election in our state. So Nick Devin, who is a member of the MOCA steering committee here today, so I'm giving this presentation in his stead and not do justice to the energy and enthusiasm for this issue, but I think it's really important to put it front and center. The special referendum election that will take place on June 13th of this year has been in the works for quite a while. And so to provide some context, one of the core recognized identified needs to advancing our work on ocean and coastal acidification and its impacts in Maine is the need to enhance our monitoring capacity. We're only beginning to understand the combination of global and local drivers in our estuaries that are causing chemical changes that are relevant to commercially important species. And there are multiple drivers, and monitoring efforts have been expanding in the state. More and more groups that are interested in participating in efforts to do ocean and coastal acidification monitoring. So that'll be a theme running through everything today. But monitoring is not going to happen unless there is money to support the equipment and the sensors that are required to get a full picture of carbonate chemistry and its various parameters in the estuary of Maine. And so last April in 2016, the legislature passed a bill to put a bond issue in the front of the voters, and it was pretty substantial support. I think only 10 members of the House of Representatives voted against it. And this is a $50 million bond that will go before the voters, and it has two components. One is a $45 million bond issue that will provide funds that will be administered competitive grants from the Maine Technology Institute for investment in research and development. And the other is $5 million in funds that will go directly to lending to and investing in small business potential. And marine sciences and the marine sector has been center in the consideration of what these monies could be used for from the get-go. There was extensive involvement of the University of Maine as well as Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences in the initial legislative hearings providing information, as well as the Jackson Lab. And so the question before voters, before you right now, and this is the one statewide question that will be on the ballot this upcoming June 13th. If you're not registered to vote in Maine, the deadline after you already passed, unfortunately, May 3rd. And some of you may not be registered to vote in Maine, but if you are registered to vote in Maine, this is what will appear on the ballot for you. Do you favor a $50 million bond issue to provide $45 million in funds for investment in research, development, and commercialization in the state to be used for infrastructure, equipment, and technology upgrades that enable organizations to gain and hold market share, to increase revenues and employment, or preserve jobs for Maine people to be awarded competitive process to Maine-based public and private entities? So the phrase in there that is relevant to the consideration for ocean and coastal acidification monitoring relates to the part the aquaculture industry and the phrase preserve jobs for people. Recognizing the potential threat of ocean acidification to commercially harvested species, grown species, this language would enable some of those funds potentially, and this is no guarantee, potentially to be issued in a competitive grant program for proposals to invest in monitoring technology relevant to this potential impact on commercially important species. So nothing's really changed in the language of this bond. There was a long saga of whether or not it would actually get on the ballot because it costs some money to run an election, but it is in fact on the ballot, and you will see it on June 13th. And prognosis from a political science perspective is relatively good for these bond issues. 16 out of 18 of these kinds of bonds since 1990 have been passed by voters, usually with about a 55% majority. And by and large, these kinds of bonds are passed. However, as it's difficult to predict what necessarily will happen on June 13th because voter turnout is likely to be quite low, given that this is the only statewide referendum question on the ballot. So because this is relevant to potentially providing significant amounts of funds, if it is in fact approved by the voters of Maine, and if in fact there is room within that $45 million for a competitive grant program that would go towards monitoring relevant to our marine industries, this is why we wanted to bring this to attention, and this is something that Mick Devon has really been advocating people to be aware of, that it's coming up, given that it's easy for these kinds of things to fly under the radar. So that is a little bit more than my 5 minutes. If you have any questions related to this update, please type them in the chat box, and I, as the question collator, will pose them to me as the presenter out loud, which will be really weird for this first presentation, but will not seem odd in the future ones, where we actually hope to have some dialogue and I can pose questions to people. So if people have any questions for me about this bond, we just wanted to give it some space to it and the background and history. And there's time for one quick one. Otherwise, we will keep to our ambitious schedule of presenters, and Curtis Bowen will pass. So I'm just going to give a few seconds to see if anyone wants to type a question, and otherwise we'll move on to the next presenter. So Nicholas Keeney asks, monitoring only or data systems in general? So there are many kinds of things that could be in this bond, including funds that are not related, obviously, to the marine sector. How exactly the RFPs and grant calls are put out has not yet been determined. We determine this once the funds are encumbered, and once the bond passes. And so data systems definitely be part of this. If it fits within research and development and commercialization and technology upgrades that enable organizations to expand employment or preserve jobs, I would imagine those could be included. Ivy asked, can you discuss how we support the bond? I'm going to answer that question very carefully as a public employee of the state of Maine. So Political science in our history tells us that these bonds pass when significant voting groups turn out. There have been a few public pieces that have been out in Bangor Daily News and other news outlets, but Nick Devin has mentioned to me that supporting awareness of this and explaining how these kinds of investments in technology and infrastructure that are relevant to jobs can help turn out the vote, that is likely to increase the likelihood of its passage. And so when I've spoken with Mick, he's indicated that support from educational and nonprofit institutions highlighting that this is really into their work in advancing capacity in Maine, likely to help convince people to go vote for it. And Bill, Timothy Haskell asks, if the bond passes, will it affect current budget discussions? Sorry for the caps lock. No worries about the caps lock. So rather than appropriations, this bond will be paid out over a number of years, ultimately $64 million to pay for the $50 million. This is why it's so politically appealing. So it's not actually part of the current budget appropriations, is my understanding. And Bill provides a comment to everyone that ocean coastal acidification monitoring may reveal economic opportunities in addition to preserving jobs. And I think that's really important. It's not just about highlighting that this is saving jobs, but that actually by investing in our capacity to do monitoring in the state, we may actually expand our employment opportunities in this sector. And I think that's a really great point, Bill. So thanks for sharing. So Meredith asked one last question, which I'm going to answer, and then we're going to cut things off and move to Curtis. Stay on time. Any new monitoring infrastructure or equipment requires continued calibration, maintenance, troubleshooting to be effective. Can this money support such maintenance? I wish I had a very, very clear answer to that question, because maintenance is always really difficult to find money for. And I think the short answer is that there's likely to be some funds that are available in the short term, but given that it's for infrastructure, equipment, technology, upgrades, I think that will be a real issue where the rubber hits the road. Highlighting that in the arts is going to be really important. So thanks for sharing that, Meredith, for flagging that for us to think about as forward. Without further ado, Esperanza will now hand things over to Curtis.
Hello there, Curtis Boland here. I think you're looking at the right.
Yes, Curtis, that looks great.
Okay, good. I'm got two related conversations to report to you guys on today, and the biggest challenge I have is that it's hard for me in a slideshow to convey the energy that's happened in the conversations that have been going on. So we're going to just have to take that as given, that there's been a lot of excitement around some of this stuff, and I want to try to give you a sense of what we're doing, what we're not. I think most of you already know who the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership is, so I'm not going to go into who we are. The critical piece for this conversation is that one of our key roles is to act as a convener around various kinds of priorities for Casco Bay, and we've got two of them that we've started up in the last year. One we're calling the Casco Bay Nutrient Council, and the other we're calling the Casco Bay Monitoring Network. I'm going to start talking about the Nutrient Council. And the reason why we started this is when we did our strategic planning a couple of years ago, we recognized that there are at least portions of Casco Bay that are showing nutrient concentrations, especially nitrogen concentrations, that are at levels of concern. And we believe that given changes in population and land use in the watershed, nutrient pollution to the bay is likely to be increasing over time. And finally, we think climate change is likely to make Casco Bay more sensitive to nutrient inputs. All of this means that although today we don't have catastrophic water quality problems in Casco Bay resulting from nutrient enrichment, we see some water quality effects, and we think they're going to get worse. So now's the time to get on the job and get ahead of this. The council is, I'll talk a little bit about structure in a minute, but the idea behind the council is that we want to hold conversations about controlling nutrients and building consensus about what we might do to do that before there's a sense of crisis. It gives us more space to have an honest conversation and to dig into information without being distracted by short-term political or legal needs. So what we're really aiming for is having a conversation that might take a couple of years to come to a common understanding of nutrient issues in Casco Bay, and answering questions like what's at risk, how vulnerable is the bay to increased nutrient loading, what kind of strategies can we employ to reduce nutrient loading to the bay, and how can we figure out what the most cost-effective way to move forward might be. And really what we're hoping to is develop a regional consensus around strategies and tactics for addressing nutrients, again, now in the situation where we're not facing a crisis, so that as things start to get more difficult to manage, when we start to see more severe impacts of nutrient enrichment on the bay, we'll be able to move forward without having to go back and fight over basics that we really should have dealt with before that happened. We don't know a whole lot about nutrients in Casco Bay, given how long we've been studying it, and that's one of the issues that has come up in our early meetings of the Nutrient Council. We know there's something in the order of about 1 million kilograms of nitrogen entering the bay annually. If you scale that out by the area of the bay, it's on the order of 23 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and that puts the loading to the Casco Bay among the lower in the major estuaries in the Northeast. So there's a reason why we're not seeing the kinds of catastrophic nutrient enrichment issues we're seeing further south. But the problem we have with this is that an awful lot of the model estimates we have on which these kinds of factoids are based on regional models with absolutely no local data plugging in to help us figure out how realistic those numbers are. And I'll talk a little bit later about one of the things that's happening this summer is really beginning to try to collect some data that can nail down some of those details about what's really coming in off of the watershed. We also know that nutrient distribution in Casco Bay is far from uniform, and there are 3, or actually I think more likely 4 areas where we see pretty consistent elevated levels of nitrogen. What I'm showing here is some data from Friends of Casco Bay showing total nitrogen, and you can see 3 areas where concentrations tend to be high around the Fore River, around the Harrisicot River, and up at the head of the New Meadows. I actually think some of the older data we've got looking at mineral nitrogen, not total nitrogen, also shows high levels around the mouth of the Royal River. So there's at least 3 and possibly 4 locations where we know we've got ongoing issues related to high levels of nitrogen that are high enough, at least periodically, to trigger concern about either dissolved oxygen concerns or impacts to eelgrass. So what we've done with the council is try to put together a body with a core membership of 12 participants representing a lot of different perspectives. We've got wastewater treatment plant operators, we've got people who focus on stormwater work, we have advocacy representatives, academic scientists. We're trying to get a representative conversation of lots of different groups going together to talk about issues. And then we have attached to that a larger advisory network that has an open membership. So any of you who want to join in, you can let me know and we'll add you to the mailing list. Everybody on that advisory network is invited to attend the meetings, but given that the level of interest we had, we couldn't imagine finding a date when everybody could make it to all the meetings. So having a smaller core membership manages the conversation a little bit neater. Everybody on the advisory network will be kept informed, and we expect as the conversation goes forward, there may be meetings where we specifically call on members of that advisory network to help us understand issues that are of concern to them. Before I get into the monitoring network, let me just finish with, we had our first real focused conversation with this group about a month ago. And there was considerable interest, clear evidence that there's a lot of interest in trying to corral better information about what we know and don't know about nutrients in the bay. We as the Estuary Partnership, we see one of our roles here is staffing this conversation. We've got a hell of a lot of work to do to respond to the questions that people have asked and the kinds of information that people want. And we're going to be probably calling on a lot of you on this phone call at one time or another to help us explain and understand some of the ways that nutrients are going to influence coastal ecosystems. Now let me switch directions to talk about our monitoring network. The monitoring network is a group of organizations that are already collecting data in Casco Bay. And we've brought them together several times now to try to coordinate monitoring more effectively. And what we've done so far is we really started out focusing on just where is monitoring actually occurring. You'd think we would know that, but we found out that we knew less than we thought we did. We want to share information on what monitoring is going on and try to minimize duplication of effort and maximize sharing and use of data so that when people are collecting data, others know about it, they know that they can use it, and we figure out how to make the most efficient use of what we actually already know about the Bay. And eventually, we want to try to develop a shared framework for monitoring and therefore be able to better plan for the future and get all these different groups working together to work more effectively. We started out really trying to take a look at what monitoring is going on in the Bay. And last time I counted, I had 15 different organizations that are monitoring in Casco Bay. I put monitoring in quotes there because some of these groups are probably short-term data collection efforts rather than really long-term monitoring programs. But they vary a lot. Different parameters, everything from people looking at salt marshes to people looking at water density to people looking at fisheries to lots and lots of different things the data is being collected out there. And every time I look at our list and talk to people about the list of that 15 organizations, somebody else adds another. So I'm sure there's a couple more out there that we don't have yet. We drafted a database about monitoring in the Bay. What we did is we sent out a questionnaire to the organizations we had identified, asking them to describe what they're doing and tell us where they're doing it. And then we put that into a database, and from that created some GIS data layers. And I think the bottom line message, at least for me, was there's a lot of data collection going on out there. And I was really surprised by the number and extent of monitoring already going on. And I thought I kind of knew what was going on in the Bay, but on this stuff, I clearly missed a lot. Let me give you an example of what that looks like. This is a map that shows locations where people are collecting water quality data of one variety or another. And just look at the number of dots. Most of the blue dots are related to work that the Maine Department of Marine Resources is doing when they're going out and looking at shellfish, and they collect as part of that salinity, temperature, and bacteria data, as well as occasionally other parameters. So there's a lot of people going out on site collecting a lot of data, but a lot of that data is not getting into the public domain. A lot of that data, when we've got those people out there, we're not leveraging their time in the field to add to the larger understanding of the Bay as effectively as we might be able to. So one of the lessons for us is there's just an awful lot happening out there, and we're beginning to see the magnitude of data much more strongly than we did before. And now we've got to figure out how do we make some sense of that. So lessons so far. First is we are collecting a lot of data, or another way to put that is we're putting a lot of people with at least some sort of instrumentation out in the field to collect information. But we're not necessarily coordinating that data collection effort to make the best use of those people's time in terms of a larger vision of what we might do in the Bay as a whole. There's a fair amount of overlap. We found a lot of situations where organizations are collecting similar data kind of near each other because they didn't know the other group was doing it or because they have slightly different monitoring needs and informations. So it's already become clear that the conversations we're having help build some sense of consensus. And one of the examples I wanted to point to this year is the last meeting of the Monitoring Council really helped nail down some ideas about how would we look at nutrients in the inner bay in Casco Bay and really try to coordinate that work and share work more efficiently. And those conversations are also leading to some real efficiencies where we're collecting nutrient data at the mouth of the Presumpscot and Royal Rivers. It turns out we had at least 2 members of the Nutrient Council who were planning on collecting that data this summer, and they hadn't talked to each other before those meetings. Really helpful to get those kinds of moments where we can say what's going on, who else is doing work there. And one of the big questions for me coming out of this is, with all that data being collected, how do we more effectively leverage that into creating an understanding of the Bay? So where do we go next? I think there's beginning to be an emerging vision through this monitoring network to create a monitoring infrastructure for Casco Bay, sort of a backbone around which other monitoring and scientific questions could be hung. One of the ideas that came up at our last meeting was the idea of establishing a few core monitoring locations where we try to get as many of the organizations that are doing things in the Bay to make sure that they're collecting commensurate information or information at commensurate locations so that they can leverage each other's expertise and investments in monitoring. Another idea that came out is that we really should be building a shared understanding or a model of Casco Bay that is based on the data we're collecting that would inform future monitoring science and management. Surprisingly, we have driven a lot of our monitoring design so far without a central, coherent idea of how we want to be doing this. There have been many different organizations and individuals making monitoring decisions for different reasons with relatively little shared sense of what the logic behind that is. And I wanted to end tying this back to ocean acidification by pointing out that we are aware at the moment of 4 different organizations with 4 separate programs that are planning on collecting ocean acidification data in Casco Bay this summer. And the question that comes up out of this kind of a conversation with the monitoring network is how do we best leverage the data from 4 locations to provide the best science and to build the best understanding of OA in the Bay and science understanding of the dynamics of the Bay as we possibly can. And I would love it if we as the Estuary Partnership or MOCA as an organization could convene a formal conversation among these groups sometime in the coming year so that we really pull that information together and look at it as a unit so that we can understand the Bay as a whole. And to me, that's the real leveraging opportunity of this kind of a structure, this kind of a network, is that we can start to see these synergies and try to figure out how do we make the best possible use of them. Thanks, that's about it. As I started out saying, it's hard to capture the enthusiasm and excitement of some of these conversations, but I think we're making some really interesting progress and getting some interesting stuff done. So thanks so much.
Great, thanks so much, Curtis, for that wonderful presentation. The map with all of the dots in the monitoring is really quite something to see. I will ask you questions as people type them into the chat. There's often a little bit of a delay as people think about what they want to ask. So I'll post.
Yep, and I would point out that particular map I showed is one of several that we produced. That one's just people collecting water quality related data. So it doesn't include people collecting data on the biota necessarily, except where they do both. So there are other maps and other data sets that we produced that relate to specific kinds of questions. We actually produced an OA specific map, but I didn't have a good copy of it to share with you guys.
Great, that's wonderful. And I certainly think we should be able to convene such a meeting as you propose. So Susie Arnold asks, just want to clarify that Island Institute and Bigelow are pulling our OA instruments out of the kelp farm off Chebeague after the kelp harvest is completed. And so they were noted on your map, but she just wanted to pass along that update. From Beth, she asks, are the maps available on the CBEP website yet?
Not yet. They after our meeting of a couple of weeks ago, we've been doing some edits to try to refine some problems we identified. We are hoping to make what will probably be the quick thing to be posted on our website will be shape files for the specific parameter groupings that we think people might be interested in, and we're hoping to have that up in the next couple of weeks.
Great, that's wonderful. So this is a question from Ivy. Referring back to your slide comparing nutrient loading in Casco Bay to the other bays, she's wondering if that slide accurately depicts nutrient loading because it fails to consider all sources of nitrogen loading in the bay. This is something that came up at the Nutrient Council, and I think you hinted at that a little bit, that maybe those aren't the right numbers, but do you want to speak a little bit to the nutrient loading, the nitrogen loading numbers on the graph you presented earlier?
Yeah, if you look at that graph, it's the vertical axis is a log scale. And I think the types of errors of not accounting for all the sources accurately are going to largely disappear in the log scale. We might be off by a factor of, 1, but we're not off by a factor of 10. So I think the graphic remains reasonably right. I would not trust the exact numbers on any of those. That goes back to a 2003 report that uses some large-scale watershed model estimates that are not based on any local data at all. So I don't actually believe the numbers are right, but I think they're not dreadfully wrong. Okay. If that sort of answers the question.
I think that helps a lot. And I had a question for you, Curtis, in terms of envisioning a final outcome of a data sharing infrastructure. It seems like thus far one of the huge outcomes of bringing all of this together has been getting people to talk to each other about things that they didn't know each other were doing. How do we move forward in trying to get groups to be able to actually use data from other groups to have a common, whether it's a common data repository, common set of protocols, all of that? I feel like there's a tremendous amount of energy right now in Casco Bay, both around ocean acidification and nutrients, which of course relate to ocean acidification in some ways. This is kind of the holy grail of monitoring, right? This perfect data repository that everyone's integrated with. But do you want to share a few more thoughts on how to go from where we are now to what the future could look like?
Yeah, well, I'll answer it in two ways. One is sociological and the other is budgetary. Sociologically, one of the challenges here is that every one of these institutions is collecting data for their own purposes and their own reasons. And for some of them, data sharing is not a high priority. Even for those for whom data sharing is a high priority, there are significant technological barriers, and that not all of these organizations have got the technical wherewithal to make that easy. So there's a fair amount of work in building the consensus that data sharing is appropriate, that the data is of value to a larger community, and that one of the things these organizations ought to be doing is preparing their data in a way that they can share it fairly reliably. And the flip side of that is making sure that potential users can understand the strengths and weaknesses of different data sets. And that gets into all of the metadata needs and things like that. Very time consuming, very expensive. And those are not costs that are borne by a central organization like us as the Estuary Partnership. They're going to be borne largely by the organizations that are doing the monitoring. So there's an interesting process of developing a consensus around what it is we're trying to accomplish and how this will benefit each of the separate organizations. That has to happen before we can drive too far towards a really coordinated data sharing infrastructure. I think that's where I would like to go. It's not obvious that that's where the whole monitoring network likes to go, and I need to honor where that organization is and what it wants to, where the members of that want it to go. From a budgetary point of view, the other challenge we run into very quickly is data collection is fairly easy. Data curation is much more difficult. And finding ways to not just build a data repository of some sort, but figure out how to maintain the data curation and pay for that long term is a significant budgetary challenge. And it's really not all that different from the long-term challenge of funding long-term monitoring in general. But anybody who's done a lot of long-term monitoring knows that it's easier to raise money to get things built than it is to keep things running in the long term. So we need to be thinking about what's the long-term funding mechanism for driving the entire monitoring network. And as we start to have a little more confidence in that, we're then in a better space to talk about how do we build the data curation framework that will make the data more readily available.
Great. Thanks so much, Curtis. And we are going to have to move on to Jason's presentation next. We really appreciate it. Thanks again for a wonderful presentation. I'll note that one of the largest words in your word cloud is will. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done. And we are now going to transfer things over to Jason Greer at the EPA Office of Research and Development.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sounds good.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. The steering committee invited me to give a little bit of an update on these much anticipated guidelines for doing some of this monitoring that we're talking about. And it's actually really nice to be following Curtis, because that was a really good sort of setup for what some of the purposes might be for this kind of monitoring effort, the kinds of monitoring efforts that are described in these guidelines. And I think before getting into the guidelines, maybe I could just use the Casco Bay effort as an example. Really, this question about the purpose of the monitoring, what the common vision is for a monitoring effort like the nutrients effort that Curtis was describing, I think includes, what kind of knowledge can we gain about the drivers of these changes in carbonate chemistry in a place like Casco Bay. And what we know to be the case in coastal environments is that the measurements that you would take of carbonate chemistry are a blend of the effects of things like nutrient enrichment and the ongoing changes in the open ocean, and how those things mix in the coastal environment is fairly site specific. And so right off the bat, if you were to say we want our monitoring effort in Casco Bay to focus on coastal acidification, you've got sort of two sort of levels of knowledge that you need, or levels of precision in those kinds of observations. If your monitoring program is intended to understand the relationship between nutrient enrichment and pH or carbonate chemistry in the bay, that's one kind of monitoring program. But if you want to be able to distinguish that from the effects of ongoing changes out in the Gulf of Maine and the open ocean, that's another kind of monitoring effort, and usually that's the kind that most people think of as ocean acidification research. So when we began working on these guidelines, it was really sort of at that moment, or I would say, I guess, after the concerns about ocean acidification began to pivot into the coastal environment. When I think, as everybody on this call probably knows, most of the concern about ocean acidification originated literally in the open ocean. And one of the first groups to really develop good guidance or guidelines about how to monitor acidification in a coastal environment was the CCAN group, or the California Current Acidification Network, out on the West Coast. And they did develop a really nice set of guidelines and discuss some of the available instrumentation. But as we began working on the East Coast, we began to perceive a big difference in sort of the trade-offs in monitoring efforts on the East Coast. Here we have, a larger number of smaller estuaries, many river-dominated systems, much more sort of fine-grained in terms of the biological activity across a given sort of coastal landscape on the East Coast. And that creates a different trade-off in terms of your decisions about, well, do you invest in a super expensive piece of equipment or a single expensive monitoring buoy, or do you invest your efforts in a sort of less expensive instrumentation but a larger effort in terms of getting out into these different environments? And obviously there's a big trade-off between those two kinds of things. You're either going for many sort of medium quality measurements versus a small number of extremely high quality measurements. That's just one of the trade-offs that we always face with designing monitoring efforts. So it was sort of against that backdrop that we began developing these guidelines, trying to sort of adapt that both the sort of open ocean perspective as well as the West Coast perspective and some of their sort of leadership in this area, and trying to sort of bring that into sharper focus for monitoring on the East Coast. So right now we've got this draft document. It is now, and let me just say briefly that I am in the Office of Research and Development within EPA. I work with Adam Pimento, who's a co-author on these guidelines. But the effort began with support from EPA's Office of Water, specifically Brian Rapoli, and we also are working closely with Matt Liebman from EPA Region 1 office, or otherwise known as EPA New England. So we're working together on the guidelines. There's very much a sort of water perspective in the guidelines, Office of Water perspective, I would say. So the status right now is that we've got a draft that was finished on May 1st that is now undergoing some initial external review. We're probably going to have some additional review steps to go through before we can officially release it, but that's where things are right now. So I'm probably not going to take up all of the time. I just want to give you a feeling for what's in the document and invite people to provide comments or ask questions about things they think might, that need to be included that we might not have occurred to thought of including. But so towards that end, I'm just going to give you some snippets of what's in the document. So I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's in the sort of 50 to 60 page range. We lay out the purpose and scope, who the audience is, which we consider to be very diverse, ranging from maybe a very well set up water quality laboratory that maybe wants to acquire a few more instruments to increase their capability to include carbonate chemistry measurements, but also all the way to the person who may have a handheld pH meter and wants to know if they can do anything useful with that would contribute to the bigger effort. So getting back to some of those issues I just discussed in terms of coastal versus ocean acidification, we talk about some of those things, and then we get into some of the factors contributing to acidification in coastal environments, and particularly those factors that are very important on the East Coast. The basics of the seawater carbonate system, and then we get into some details on things like how to collect bottle samples. Then the analyzing bottle samples would be things like, what kinds of instrumentation do we use? Very briefly, talk about some of the instrumentation that's used, the autonomous sensors like CFETs and the SAMI sensors and things like that. And then, as a lot of people probably know, if you're interested specifically in pH, the total pH of a water body can be calculated from other kinds of measurements. So we get into some of the tools that are used for doing that. And then something that some of us consider to be one of the biggest distinctions between studying this issue in the coastal environment versus the open ocean would really boil down to these sampling concepts and uncertainty concepts. Because the coastal environment is so much more dynamic than the open ocean, again, it leads to a different kind of trade-off between the amount of effort you invest in an individual sample versus the amount of effort you invest in gaining a lot of samples. With that number of samples being something that's just extremely important in an environment as complex and heterogeneous as a U.S. East Coast environment. So I'm going to go through a couple of these sections, not all of them, but just to sort of drill down a little bit and give a little bit more detail of what we're covering. So on this question of factors contributing to acidification on the East Coast, we go through each of these many factors. These are the main ones that could drive a pH signal. With eutrophication being the obvious one linked to the kind of efforts that Curtis was talking about. And there's a pretty good body of literature, I think, as everyone may know. There's a pretty good body of literature linking eutrophication, nutrient enrichment to changes in carbonate chemistry. So if that's what you're interested in, you're interested in understanding that linkage, that changes the kind of monitoring program that you might need. If you want to understand, for example, if there's a nutrient abatement effort, as there is in Narragansett Bay, you want to understand how the ecosystem is responding to that. Your standards in terms of weather quality versus climate quality measurements are different. It is necessary to be able to tease out the longer term background climate change effect, but you're also going to be very interested in coordinating your measurements with measurements of what's going on, say, for example, in the nitrogen cycle. And actually, let me back up for a second. We do make reference to these in the guidelines to the difference between weather quality versus climate quality measurements. These are definitions that are provided by the GOON website, GOA-ON Global Ocean Acidification Monitoring Network or something like that. I can't remember the exact acronym, but they give very formal definitions of weather quality objectives versus climate quality objectives. And these play a big role in developing guidelines like this and helping the monitoring groups that sort of articulate what their goals are. So we go into each of these different drivers very briefly. This regional lithology and aquatic geochemistry are very important for an organization like EPA because of our interest in on national scale solutions and how, whether those solutions can be need to be regionally specific. For example, you have different drivers of or different levels of alkalinity coming out of the Mississippi River than you do, say, in a New England watershed because of the granitic lithology in New England. So trying to just raise some awareness of those kinds of questions. All right, so moving on here. This is really drilling down into some of the specific kinds of information that we're trying to provide in the guidelines, details on the types of sample containers that are good to use, how they should be cleaned, preferred order of sample collection. So as an example, if you're out on boats using Niskin bottles or GoFlow bottles and you're collecting for nutrients and for gases like CO2 or for carbonate chemistry, there's a preferred order because a sample for CO2 or for dissolved inorganic carbon is extremely sensitive to how that sampling bottle is pulled out of the water and how it's handled on the deck of the boat and the order in which the sample bottles are filled. So getting into some of those kinds of details. And then also things like what kinds of bottles are ideal for long-term storage. Short-term storage is better if you want to avoid using things like the toxic preservatives that are involved in long-term storage, but requires a higher quality. Or if you want to avoid preservation, you've got to do analyses immediately. So getting into things like that. We're working, the sampling without preservation question is actually something that we're working on right now in an experiment that we recently completed, but are hoping to include in the next version of the guidelines. And basically, it gets at this question of, which turns out to be an extremely important question for monitoring, is if you take a sample, how long does that sample stay good before it starts, without being preserved? So this has come up in some of EPA's monitoring efforts where there are folks who are interested in incorporating carbonate chemistry measurements, say, for example, in National Coastal Condition Assessment. But since many of those sampling efforts are conducted from small outboard motorboats, it's just not feasible to require samples to be preserved with mercuric chloride as soon as they come out of the water, because you're not going to be asking crews on these small boats to carry that kind of toxic preservative out to sea with them. So then does that mean that it's satisfactory to wait until the sample has made its way back to shore and then is preserved at that time? And strangely enough, none of the standard operating procedures are specific on this question. They just simply say samples should be preserved immediately, but no one really is clear about whether immediately means within 15 minutes or within 15 hours. So we're hoping to include some measurements on how fast samples degrade, because if you can take a sample and then carry it to shore, that really opens up a lot of flexibility for how monitoring can be conducted. Let's see what else here. We're going to give some detail on sampling equipment. A lot of these things are coming from our own experience in increasing our capacity over the past decade, and some of the types of sampling equipment we've tried and found successful. So those kinds of lessons and insights are kind of filter their way into these guidelines. Let's see. Then analyte-specific sampling techniques just gets into, for example, if you're taking a sample just for alkalinity, that may that has a different type of handling requirement than, say, a sample that's going to be analyzed for dissolved inorganic carbon. Okay, so I just want to talk about a couple of the appendices, some of the other sort of details in the guidelines. What we do in our lab here is we basically start with the famous guidelines for doing carbonate chemistry. I think they're known as I've forgotten the handbook. It's Sabine and Dixon and all those folks from the West Coast who have been working on carbonate chemistry out in the open ocean and for the purposes of global carbon cycle analysis and things like that, and have published a whole series of standard operating procedures for the specific components of carbonate chemistry. But they're intentionally, and this is why guidelines like this end up being needed, is a standard operating procedure written by a group like that is intentionally broad because many different laboratories are going to use that standard operating procedure, and each laboratory is going to have a different kind of equipment, different work environment, different types of supporting facilities. So when it gets down to being a specific laboratory and still trying to make your methods repeatable, it becomes necessary to take an SOP like the Dixon SOPs or whatever we refer to them as, and making one that's specific for your own facility. So we provide a couple of examples of that that we've used here in our lab in Narragansett. So this is just another thing that we're trying to do, which I think might end up in some ways being one of the most useful things in the guidelines, is we try to set up different sort of scenarios thinking about our audience and the perspectives that they might be coming from as they use the guidelines. So we begin with our own laboratory, a water quality research laboratory, and give an itemized list of everything that we use to do good carbonate chemistry in the coastal environment. It ends up being a very long list, including some very expensive items, some expensive instrumentation, boats, freezers, all these kinds of things. And then we have several other scenarios, and I think it might, this is something that we could potentially expand in the guidelines. But, just thinking of 3 other examples of what types of groups might use these guidelines. One scenario is you might be a small laboratory that might consider it feasible to, say, purchase one expensive instrument. And so this first box here talks about some work that we saw recently. There are other examples of things like this where there is it's possible that a single instrument could be used to completely constrain the carbonate system in a seawater sample, as opposed to having to buy multiple pieces of equipment. Another scenario would be one that tends to arise with some of the national estuary programs. I think it's probably the case with the Casco Bay effort, where you have a sensor deployed in a particular place that's operated sort of maintained day to day by local staff or scientists in the immediate area, but then is sort of quality controlled or ground truthed against discrete water bottle samples that are analyzed by a complete water quality research laboratory. So that's, I know of Casco Bay is one example that's doing it that way. I believe Mass Bays is going in that direction, where they plan to install a device, but don't see setting up a full water quality laboratory as being something in their future. So they're sort of ground truthing their high frequency measurements with these discrete bottle samples that they will then send off to a laboratory to have them be fully analyzed. So, and then this third example is a situation that actually we have specifically encountered, where we were working with a shellfish hatchery. We were basically just obtaining spat for some of our own ecological experiments in Narragansett Bay, and got into conversation about about pH and found that this shellfish hatchery had actually been measuring pH in their hatchery for decades, just as a way to monitor the condition of their cultures within the hatchery. So they actually already had quite a bit of knowledge about how pH changes on a diurnal basis and how sensitive it is to the amount of biological activity within their tanks. But we're also curious about, okay, when it becomes time for them to replace their handheld pH sensor, what are some of the things they should consider? And, is there anything they can do to try to understand what's going on with the carbonate chemistry in their intake waters at the hatchery? And we felt pretty strongly that those kinds of measurements should not be discouraged. If you go to if you talk to a chemical oceanographer who's studying the global carbon cycle, they probably would not find those measurements to be of much use. But on the other hand, we're not working in the open ocean, we're working in a coastal environment, and there's tremendous value. Obviously, I think it's probably obvious to everyone, there's tremendous value in even just being able to see what goes on between daytime and nighttime in a hatchery, and then starting from there, start trying to put that into a broader perspective, perhaps by working with other groups. So I think that was my last slide. So it kind of intentionally left time for questions. I don't know how much time I ended up using, but happy to take questions. I'm going to go back to my first slide so that my email address is visible in case anyone wants to send me any suggestions or questions about the guidelines. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason, for a really wonderful presentation. You did use 20 minutes, but I think there's a tremendous amount there that's incredibly useful to the group here. So we are going to have a few questions, even though we know we're running a tiny bit behind. I wanted to leave some space for questions for Jason. And Bill Mook asked a question, which I think you addressed in a slide after he asked it, which was whether the intro discussion of coastal acidification includes a discussion of freshwater runoff, including its impacts. And you talked about regional lithology and chemistry as well. So I'm going to jump to the next question from Will Otto at UMaine Machias, which is there anything in the guidelines that addresses sediment pH measurements and measurements of pH in sediments?
No, not specifically. I mean, we do talk about the importance of sediment processes in driving water column carbonate chemistry, but in terms of methods for measuring what's going on in the sediments, no, there isn't anything. I'd be interested to know whether folks consider that to be a need. I know it's considered a need in Maine, and I'm frankly not aware of much consensus on how to do that properly without going through expensive probes really rapidly. I know the Friends of Casco Bay have been playing with that, so I'd be interested in any knowledge anybody can pass along that we might be able to incorporate into the guidelines.
Great. Well, certainly take that as a charge to our group of 33 attendees. So Ron Huber asks, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has conducted acid remediation of salmon streams, often using shells. Are those kinds of issues being factored in or considered in these guidelines? I think it's a broader question about measuring carbonate chemistry as it relates to remediation efforts, which are one thing that we've talked about more broadly.
Yeah, we haven't gotten into any of those kinds of responses, adaptive or mitigating responses, other than the linkage to nutrient enrichment. But I would hope that the information that one would need, like if you were setting up an experiment to look at that, or setting up a restoration project and wanted to know how to take the measurements to determine whether that kind of mitigation strategy was having an effect, I would hope that these guidelines would allow you to get started with that and give you an idea of what kinds of measurements would be needed.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason. As you said, your email is there if there are more questions from our group. We are going to move on now so that we can keep to our program.
Yeah, sorry for using up all the time, but thanks again.
No, it's really informative and really great to see everything. So I really appreciate it. And we are now going to move on to Beth Turner, who will be following up on everything that Jason just presented.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna, oops, I think I just did not, okay, I have to actually get out of my slides in order to accept the invitation to share my screen. So hang on just a minute.
Sorry about that, Beth.
Esperanza, you might have to send that again to me.
Okay.
You might have to take it and then send it back to me.
Okay. Where's this one?
No, because she already is the presenter. So
Yeah.
just make yourself presenter.
Okay.
Now go back to hit show my screen. Change presenter.
Mm-hmm. There she is.
Okay, now I can share. And hopefully we will be able to see. Are you good, Esperanza?
Oh, that's great, Beth. Thank you.
Okay.
Looks great.
So I wanted to tell you a little bit about some things that are going to be coming up later in the summer and fall, following on to Jason's work in developing the guidelines. And this is a series of workshops that we want to be able to give some hands-on experience, because I think the guidelines are going to be great as a kind of a standalone guide for reference, but many people learn better when they can actually get their hands in there and actually see things. And so that's what we're going to try to do with these Train the Trainer workshops. So Jason, thank you. That was a great introduction. And we knew that these guidelines were coming out. And at that time, there was an internal competition within NOAA through the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program for mini grants for educational purposes, education and outreach purposes.
Beth?
And several of us, yeah?
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You have the GoToMeeting screen that's in front of your slide. If you can just get rid of that little.
I don't know, can I? I can move it.
Yeah, great.
I don't want to leave it.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So at that time, we knew that this competition was open within NOAA. And because I work for NOAA, I had an opportunity to apply for it. We also had a series of stakeholder workshops that NECAN ran in various states around the region. Those were held in a few years ago, maybe 3-4 years ago. And some of the things that came out of those workshops were a desire to standardize monitoring protocols and a need for guidance and training to ensure that the data are uniform and useful. And as we've seen in our call today, there's been a lot of interest in a lot of different groups about monitoring, and these groups have different capabilities. And I think that Jason gave a good introduction to one way that he's thinking about trying to apply for all those groups. So, I don't know why I'm not. So we wrote a proposal to develop citizen science monitoring programs in accordance with this EPA guidelines document. And we hope to be able to provide in-person training and educational materials. And we're going to have 3 regional workshops, and we're aiming for Maine, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. We want to be able to coordinate with NECAN on this and to use a lot of NECAN's capacity and networking capability. One of the really main outcomes of this work, I think, is going to be promoting this regional collaboration and developing partnerships among these monitoring programs. And we want to be able to document the process to be able to replicate it elsewhere. So we're envisioning day-long conferences, fairly small in number of people, because we want to be able to allow for a pretty good experience with the monitoring equipment. Probably the morning presentations will be kind of basics on some of the introductory material that's in Jason's guidelines. And we want to be able to give some regional examples of people who are local and who are doing some monitoring for ocean and coastal acidification parameters. And then in the afternoon, we want to be able to get people to use the equipment, to be able to see what it looks like, to see what the data looks like coming off of it, to give really a hands-on experience there. And we're going to be looking for workshop locations that might allow us to go out in the field or off a dock or something like that. So for the Maine workshops, we're looking maybe early September, Massachusetts maybe late September, and Connecticut in October. And we recognize that with a group of less than 20 people, we're not going to have a very big impact region-wide. So what we're looking for is for the participants in the workshop to extend this impact beyond just the workshop itself. So we want to be able to provide materials and resources that they can take with them or they can refer to as they go out into their communities and interact with other citizen science networks, so that this grows beyond the workshop participants. We're going to be doing a pre-workshop survey and a post-workshop survey to try to document people's ideas and reactions. And we're going to be documenting the whole process so that we can provide this as a resource for other regions that might want to do something similar. So here's my contact information. Esperanza is, as part of her duties through Maine Sea Grant, is heavily involved, and Parker is kind of our engine who's going to keep the whole thing going. He's Aaron's graduate student, and he's going to be doing a whole lot of the work on it. So I open that up for any questions now, or there's our contact information for questions later.
Great. Thanks so much, Beth, for that great presentation, and it really follows on nicely from what Jason presented, and it's an exciting set of workshops. Are there questions for Beth about this mini grant and the citizen science training? Give it just a moment, as there's often a little bit of a delay, and then we'll move on to our final presentation from Michelle Levine at Bowdoin if there aren't any questions for Beth. Great. So Beth, there are no questions that have appeared, but I think that was a really clear presentation about what our plans are, and anyone can be in touch with you or Esperanza or Parker if they have further questions, and obviously all of these things are relating.
Great, thank you.
All right, our final presentation is from Michelle Levine at Bowdoin College, who's going to be talking about some intercalibration efforts and thoughts. And I think we'll follow on nicely with the introductions we've just had from Jason and Beth.
Great, thanks, Aaron. I don't know if you can see my screen currently.
We can, if you can.
Oh, you can?
Yeah, right now we can.
Okay, so you can see the slide now.
Yeah, there
Perfect.
You go. Okay,
thank you.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for hanging in till the end. I'll just speak briefly about some ideas that we've been tossing around about intercomparing methods for pH and possibly other parameters throughout Maine through the MOCA group. I'm at Bowdoin College in the Department of Earth and Oceanographic Science, and as I've mentioned at a couple of these meetings, we are getting online a carbonate chemistry monitoring platform at our Coastal Study Center in Harpswell Sound, partly with the help of Joe Salisbury, who's getting us a PCO2 sensor that we're pairing with some other instrumentation. And through setting up that platform and researching methods for pH specifically and some of the other instruments, I've really been running into some of the questions that the other presenters outlined, which is that a lot of the best practices recommendations that are out there are really based on the open ocean precision that's needed for pH. And I've really come up against the question of whether we really need that level of precision for the types of questions that we're asking and what is really appropriate for the coastal zone. And so I've just got a couple of discussion points up here that sort of summarize those recommendations that are out there in these Dixon methods and so forth, which suggest using some either pretty labor-intensive lab-based or benchtop methods that involve making up your own pH buffers or benchtop spectrophotometric techniques or more costly instruments than probably most of us use for our field sampling campaigns. And a lot of this goes back to the fact that, and a big question I think for us has to do with the fact that the calibration of our glass, a lot of our glass pH electrodes use sort of traditional Fisher buffers that are not matched to our matrix of our samples, and our sampling often spans a large salinity gradient. And so since the calibrations can be sensitive to salinity and you can have offsets at different salinities, that's where a lot of these questions arise in this, what I'm calling the open ocean literature and these best practices methods. So I've been really looking forward to the EPA guidelines for the coastal zone, because I think that'll be really helpful for us to think about whether we need weather versus climate precision for the questions that we are answering. And so I'm just showing an example over here on the right of two sections that my intro class last year actually collected along the Kennebec, where we started down at Fort Popham on the right of the slide and moved northward up the estuary and just looking at salinity and pH measurements alongside each other. And you can see we're spanning a really large salinity and also a really large pH gradient. And so obviously if we have small offsets due to calibrations on the order of 0.03 pH units or so, we would still capture that large pH gradient along an estuary or see differences in runoff throughout the year, for example. But if we want to look at, if we're setting up a monitoring system throughout the state, that would involve trying to make predictions on a climate sort of scale to see how one location pH change might change over the course of years or decades, then we might actually be interested in trying to get at that climate level question, even in a dynamic coastal environment. And so one idea that just sort of popped up in some of our monitoring subgroup meetings and at the Maine Water Conference was whether we could start to kind of building on maybe some of the work by MOCA or these training workshops that we were just discussing, building off the EPA guidelines, is whether there would be interest in doing something like a pH method intercalibration cruise, where a bunch of us brought our instruments that we calibrate in different ways and maybe follow, the really precise methods of the Dixon methods, for example, or some of the more commonly used techniques, and we just all kind of collected data along some estuary, something like what I'm showing on the right, and seeing if these different techniques result in wildly different pictures of what pH looked like just in one sort of snapshot in time along an estuary. And I mentioned that because at Bowdoin, one thing that we did decide to do was we're getting set up to do spectrophotometric pH as a way to cross-check our less precise sensor for pH that we're putting into our platform. And also we're going to use that for collecting data from our biological experiments in the lab as well. So in putting that together, I was wondering if there might be interest or if that technique could be of use for something like an intercomparison cruise, where we could really use that instrument to cross-check other sensors that are being used more widely out there. There are also methods that have been published that use the spec. So the spec just uses a dye that's pH sensitive. That's what's shown at the top right with a sort of different colored cuvettes. And it just responds to pH and supposedly is not sensitive to salinity and doesn't need to be calibrated. And so I have a student that's working this summer to get us set up to do that and sort of try to dial in that method for us at Bowdoin. And so once we have that set up, there may be opportunities to kind of link into some of the networks and workshops that have been discussed here to try to do some sort of inter-comparison. So that was just an idea that had sort of popped out on a cruise, or some sort of linkage to the workshops is something that I'd be curious to hear if people were interested in, and sort of opportunity that might be out there down the road. So happy to take any questions or discussion about that if there's interest.
Great, thanks so much, Michelle. The interest that we have so far is Jason Greer says, yes, exclamation point, great idea. Double exclamation point. And I think I want to underscore that the enthusiasm from Esperanza and myself and others here for this intercomparison cruise, I think it would be really fantastic. Are there questions specifically for Michelle in terms of this idea that she's laid out here to build on all of these other efforts and meetings, and in relation to them to get everyone together?
Aaron, can you repeat that question?
Sure. So basically, my question is, are there questions for Michelle about her proposed idea? Jason writes, see the APOCA comparisons for effects of uncertainty in specific parameters on higher level calculations. We include those in the EPA guidelines.
Okay, great.
Susie asks, do you have a time frame in mind for when to do this cruise that you're thinking of?
Yeah, so I think that it would make sense. Well, I mentioned that I have a student this summer that's working on the sort of benchtop method with the spectrophotometer that I expect to be hopefully kind of fine-tuned and dialed in this summer. And I thought it would make sense to really build off of the EPA guidelines, and maybe if there are these workshops going on where different groups are learning different methods from the guidelines, that it might make sense to kind of think about this within the time frame of those workshops. And, depending on how many groups we're talking about, there might be an opportunity for me to apply for funding, internal funding through Bowdoin for boat time, if it's larger than just a couple of people that could fit on one of our Bowdoin boats. The Iris Sea, I think, would be a great platform for that, but that might require a little bit of lead time as well. But I guess that would be sort of a point for discussion, what would work for others, and within the time frame of the guidelines and things like that coming out.
Yeah, that's a really exciting proposal, and I think that's why we have these meetings. Parker Gassett asks, in relation to aligning this with Beth's presentation about the trainings, were you thinking of this cruise most likely just in Maine and not also in Massachusetts and Connecticut where those other trainings are? And my guess is probably just in Maine to start with.
That was what I had thought, since I was really thinking about this group in particular, and the results might be applicable to other locations that might be using similar techniques in estuaries. But that doesn't mean that other people can't do it as well.
Right.
So there's another question.
But I think that the comment that comes up that Ron has posted here is also important for us to think about as to what level of precision is really important for the questions that different groups are talking about. I think in this group, we've talked a lot about monitoring, and it sounds like we're going to try to have some coordinated monitoring effort that would be sort of long term. So to me, I interpreted that as really tracking the impacts of climate change that may point to sort of climate level precision. But it's absolutely true that some locations that are really heavily impacted by things like acid contaminated waste is the example that's given here. Whether you use a spec or a YSI, you would still capture that those sort of shifts that you may not really need to worry about the open ocean kind of recommendations that are out there.
Great. Thanks so much, Michelle, for putting that idea in front of us. One last note from Jason, you can see there because you've exited your presentation. So my job is kind of,
yes.
Thanks for doing that. But
Too eager.
There is a lot of follow-up from this meeting. And so in the last 5 minutes that we have, the goal is really just to say that the purpose of having this spring update was to have exactly these kinds of exchanges and conversations to connect people who are working on similar ideas and similar things together, whether it's in Casco Bay, whether it's in monitoring methodologies, whether it's in making some of those methods more relevant to the wide number of groups that are already doing monitoring that we heard about. And so we urge everyone to be in touch with each other and with the MOCA partnership about this work as we move forward. And, speaking for myself, I think it's a wonderful idea to think about how to link this intercomparison cruise idea with the training workshops that are likely to happen this fall. So the MOCA partnership has been, for the last year and a half, hosting several times a year symposia and workshops and meetings, and we really appreciate everyone tuning in for our first webinar, which I think was a really great way to share all of this information and catalyze these conversations. You heard about many of the things that are coming down the pipeline, and you'll likely be seeing more information about these trainings and workshops, about the EPA guidelines, about the work of the Nutrient Council and the Casco Bay Monitoring Group as well. We will provide updates just to share with everyone who wasn't able to make it today about what was presented here. We will also send around updates from an upcoming meeting on June 19th, where we'll continue some of these conversations, and many of you will see there. But we just wanted to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar, and we are able to finish by 2:30. Thanks to all of our presenters. Yeah.
Yes, this is Esperanza, and I just want to extend my thanks to the presenters and to everyone who participated today. And we might even be able to send out a very brief survey to see what you thought and ways that we can maybe do this in the future that makes sense, and any topics that you might be interested in learning more about. This will be recorded, and we'll send you a link on the website, which is housed at Maine Sea Grant. So thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, everybody.